good evening, and it is really, really great seeing you all here and to have you joining us for this event tonight. Our guest presenter this evening is Naomi Oreskes. Naomi is a self-described geologist, historian, speaker, skier, apparently rock climber, and mother. Oh, and yes, she also happens to be the co-author of Merchants of Doubt, which was also made into a film, and more recently, The Collapse of Western Civilization. Both of these books are really quite amazing and definitely worth the read. And we do have books out in the front. I would be saying that anyway. I've read the books. I give them as gifts. They are really quite important and very good reads. So recommend them highly. So I will just briefly tell you that Merchants of Doubt describes the tobacco industry's campaign to sow doubt about the integrity of scientific findings related to the health risks of tobacco, a playbook that has also been used with, unfortunately, devastating effect to sow doubt about the science of climate change. Naomi has won numerous awards and international recognition for her contributions to the public's understanding of climate change and the invaluable role of science in society. She also happens to speak about her topics fluently in 2 languages, science and clear English, much to our benefit. She has a brilliant mind, and she is an original and imaginative thinker. She is a steadfast defender of science and evidence-based facts, and yes, there are no other facts. So what you won't find out about reading her bio or her resume is that she also possesses an enormous heart. Because it takes heart to do the work she's undertaken with such dedication and bravery. And I will tell you, cowards do not take on the fossil fuel industry, and I think that bravery is fueled by a heart, a large heart. So thank you, Naomi. It's an honor to introduce you to Naomi Oreskes. Naomi, come on up.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I have a slightly strange setup here, so I'm going to do my best to speak without tripping on these wires. But thank you all for being here tonight. As Lana said, oh, can't hear me? No, I'm supposed to have, it fell on the floor? No, it didn't. Okay, that's something else on the floor. Okay.
I think the lavalier is for the recording.
Oh, I see. Oh, it's got it. Okay. Good to know. Thank you. Anyway, as Lana said, I've spoken in a lot of places all over the world on 6 continents about this subject, so it's kind of special to be here tonight talking to my friends and neighbors. So thank you all for being here. And I started with this slide because one of the reasons I like doing challenging outdoor activity is because I believe in healthy body, healthy mind, but also because there are those crucial moments like this one when you haven't a clue what's going to happen next. But you know that the only way to go is forward. And fighting climate change is kind of like that. We don't know where this story ends. We don't know how we're going to fix it. But we do know, without any shadow of a doubt, that we can't give up. There's no turning back. And we have to go forward. So that's kind of my punchline, but I thought it's always good to start with the end. So anyway, so as Lana knows, Lana and I have talked about a lot, it's very hard to talk about climate change. Not because it's controversial. I'm a professor. My whole life is dedicated to discussing and debating ideas, problems, challenging things. Academic life wouldn't be interesting if we didn't talk about things that were challenging. But it's difficult because it breaks all the official rules of good communication. So if you talk to anyone who's an expert in communication, they will tell you, be honest, be authentic. Nobody likes a fake. Tell a story. But also, nobody likes bad news. And climate change is a bad news story. It's a seriously bad news story with a potentially very unhappy ending. And spoiler alert, if you read The Collapse of Western Civilization, I can tell you it doesn't end well. So if we tell the truth about this, a lot of adults are not going to like it, and a lot of children are going to be frightened. But if we don't tell the truth, then people won't know how bad it is, how serious the problem is, and they won't be motivated to act. So we have this fine line we have to thread, or that's a fine line we have to walk, sorry to mix my metaphors, right? To tell the truth, to explain how serious this really is without frightening people and without making them so depressed that they just go home and watch Game of Thrones. So we also have to find grounds for hope and for pointing the way forward. So I want to start a little bit today by telling you how bad it is, and then I will try to point the way forward and hopefully leave you motivated rather than depressed. So scientifically, as Lana said, I've spent about half of my professional career studying the history of climate science, trying to understand how it is that scientists came to understand this problem, and how bad it really is. And the answer is really bad. And we've known for a long time that it was really bad. So I first started talking seriously about this issue in 2005. So I went back and dug up this old slide. So this is from NASA, and you can see it refers to 2001-2005 mean surface temperature anomaly, so how much the Earth had warmed up relative to a baseline of 51 to 80. In 2005, so nearly 15 years ago, the Earth had already warmed up 0.5 degree Celsius. Already then we knew that the Earth was warming seriously. And we also knew that that warming was not equally distributed, so that 5-degree average hid some parts of the world, particularly in the North Polar regions, where warming had already reached 2 degrees C. So we talk about 2 degrees as a sort of limit or threshold for avoiding serious danger, but we had already crossed that threshold in many parts of the globe more than a decade ago. Today, most of the northern hemisphere has already experienced 2 degrees warming. Most of the northern hemisphere. It's all red now. Now, of course, none of this comes as a surprise to scientists. Scientists predicted this more than 100 years ago because it's basic physics. It's high school physics. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That means it traps heat in the Earth's atmosphere. So if you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then temperature pretty much has to rise. And that is, of course, exactly what has happened. And all of you, I'm sure, have seen these diagrams, the most important of which is the one on the right here, which shows, if anybody is wondering about natural variability, yes, carbon dioxide varies naturally, that's true, but if we look at the history of natural variability, and we have data now going back nearly 1 million years from ice cores, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now is higher than it has ever been in the last, well, this slide goes back 400,000, but we can go back 1 million. The current CO2 level, as most of you know, has gone over 400 parts per million, and actually it's worse than that because the CO2 equivalent, that is to say carbon dioxide plus the other greenhouse gases, is something like 480 parts per million. We also have really bad news about sea level rise. We know for sure now something that a group of scientists, myself included, have been talking about for a long time, that the earlier estimates of sea level rise were all too low. If we go back to 2007, so go back 12 years now, the IPCC at the time said that we probably would not see more than 1 meter of sea level rise by the year 2100. In 2009, a major scientific paper said that that was wrong, that the right answer was probably something more like 1 to 1.5 meters. And I know you're all scientifically literate because this is Concord and Carlisle, so I'm not going to translate that into feet. You can cope with it. But now, NOAA tells us that actually the answer is between 1 and 2.5 meters. So I will translate that into 2.5 meters. That's nearly 10 feet of sea level rise. So think about what that would mean for Boston, for Florida, and for so many other places in the United States and around the world. Just to give you one example, Zillow, the real estate website, so not the Sierra Club, not EDF, not the Carlisle Democratic voters, but Zillow, right, a private sector website, estimates that 1.9 million American homes are within 2 meters of current sea level with a combined value of $888 billion. That's real money. And here's a picture of what would happen to Florida. Pretty much the whole southern tip of Florida, including Miami, would be underwater, literally underwater, not just economically. And of course, it's not just Florida. Almost 300 US cities would lose at least half their homes. 36 US cities would be pretty much lost completely, barring some kind of major intervention. Here's San Diego, where I used to live. Huge amounts of expensive infrastructure, including hotels, airports, roads, bridges, and of course, a major Navy base and Air Force installations. Almost all of the US Navy installations in San Diego would be underwater. Sea level rise will require most of the Earth's major cities to re-engineering themselves in the 21st century. And of course, this raises the question, who's going to pay for all this? And of course, massive global displacement. The Bay of Bengal is one of the most vulnerable places in the world. It's been estimated by 35 million people could be displaced by sea level rise by the end of this century. Island nations, entire island nations such as Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the Maldives could be lost completely. As many as 200 million people worldwide could be displaced. And think about how serious the Syrian refugee crisis was when 2 million people were displaced in Europe. Now imagine that 100-fold. So it's bad. And then there's biodiversity. Most of you saw the report, more than 1 million species at risk. We are now in the 6th extinction, and this extinction, unlike the previous other 5 major extinctions, which were geological phenomenon, this one is an anthropogenic phenomenon. We are driving the extinction of massive numbers of plants and animals on this planet. Now, that's not mostly caused by climate change. It's primarily caused by deforestation and land use changes, urbanization, suburbanization, but a major part of it is related to climate change because of the impact of climate change on ocean ecosystems. And of course, you all know, I don't have to belabor the point, so many other impacts. Global warming aggravates droughts, floods, storms, wildfires, fires, ice and permafrost loss, all of which are costly, all of which hurt people and their communities. But it's not just the scientific evidence that is pointing to a very bad situation. As we know, and this is why you're here tonight, our political situation is bad too. So I thought I would summarize this just by showing you 2 clips from the film Merchants of Doubt. I know some of you have seen it, but for those of you who haven't, and in a nutshell, this kind of summarizes the story of the disinformation that we have been facing on this issue for more than 20 years now. So here's the basic storyline. Who are the merchants of doubt? And as most of you know, largely driven by the fossil fuel industry, but also driven by free market ideologues who are opposed to government intervention. So here's just a little clip that shows you who these folks are and what they have to say.
Bill O'Keefe is Executive Vice President of the American Petroleum Institute. He's also a board member of the Global Climate Coalition, made up of oil and electric companies, automakers, and others.
We believed it was a war on oil. They had an off-oil agenda. Climate change was part of that. I think that it's unfortunate that the science is so distorted and misstated. And without
the science is complicated. There are lots of different factors, so you really have to understand the whole picture.
There is a natural variability that has nothing to do with man.
Climate is changing naturally.
It has to do with sunspots. It has to do with the wobble of the earth.
And so it's not too difficult to persuade some of the public that we really don't know for sure. And so maybe let's wait a while. We need to have more proof.
We need more data. The science isn't there to make that determination.
There is no need for us to rush to this kind of judgment to respond.
Others put out ads saying more pollution is going to be good for us.
A doubling of the CO2 content of the atmosphere will produce a tremendous greening of planet Earth.
CO2 is a benefit to plant life. It's increasing the bounty and the productivity of the planet, our ability to feed populations in this world.
What you're seeing here from the coal industry is perfectly analogous to what the tobacco industry used to do. They refuse to change, refuse to shift, and they're trying to convince us that it's actually good for us, the way they used to say, luckies make you healthy.
So when Eric Conway and I first started doing this work, one of the things we were interested in trying to explain was, why would anyone believe any of this? I mean, isn't it obvious that Lee Raymond has a vested interest in selling more oil and gas? And isn't it obvious that Don Blankenship of the CEO of a coal company, is not a reliable source of information about climate science. So part of the work we did in Merchants of Doubt was to explain how they try to make this disinformation credible. And a major way they do that is by dressing it up as science, by making it look as if it was science. So we call this facsimile science or Potemkin village science. And so here is a clip that explains that. They present themselves as scientific, and they even use graphics to make them look like the actual scientific reports that they're trying to discredit.
This is a report produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And here is the mirror of that, produced by the Cato Institute. They've adopted the exact same page layout and design. If you were a congressman, how would you tell the difference between this and this one? And that's the point of this deception.
This is kind of an extended summary. It's called a synthesis report.
So
the actual IPCC report is about so thick.
And how thick is your NIPCC report?
Same.
It's
the same.
You're as thick as they are?
We strictly use the same thickness.
Okay, so we see the key strategy is to confuse people, create doubt, and to make these disinformation claims look as if they are actually scientific information, and also to rely on third parties like the Cato Institute or this NIPCC group to make it seem that it's as if it's not the fossil fuel industry that's behind this, even though in most cases these efforts are being funded by the fossil fuel industry. So why is this so bad? Well, I think it's fairly obvious, but we're in a situation now where the merchants of doubt, people who 20 years ago were dismissed by the New York Times as being trivial, unimportant, just a sideshow, these people have pretty much taken over the federal government. Some of you know that Myron E. Bell, who is a longtime economist at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and one of the most notorious climate change deniers of the 90s and 2000s, headed the EPA transition team. Also on that team was Steve Malloy, who, without irony, calls himself the junk man and runs a website called junkscience.com. He was a longtime defender of the tobacco industry, worked closely with R.J. Reynolds Tobacco. Scott Pruitt, we probably don't need to say anything more about. But let me just say one thing about Rex Tillerson. He's not the Secretary of State any longer, but when he was nominated, I know a lot of people who said to me, well, isn't this good? I mean, he's a grown-up, and he said that he knows climate change is real. Well, I want to show you one more clip, because when Tillerson was nominated, I think the question we needed to ask ourselves, of all the possible people in the United States that this president could have been asked to serve as Secretary of State, why this man who has never served a day in public office? Well, as we know, our current president has some interesting relationships to the Russian government, so I want to just show you a film clip that talks about one other very interesting relationship.
Top US oil company ExxonMobil and Russia's Rosneft have signed a deal to develop oil and gas reserves in the Russian Arctic.
One of the reasons this deal is now possible is because of the human-induced global warming that has rolled the ice back. It's warmer in the Arctic than it's been in at least 40,000 years. And yet there's ExxonMobil looking at that, thinking they can drill more. The very thing they paid groups to tell us wouldn't happen has now benefited.
And if you'll remember also, the only thing really standing between ExxonMobil drilling in the Arctic, between them, standing in the way of that, was the Ukrainian sanctions. And one of the first things Tillerson did when he became Secretary of State was to announce his intention to try to repeal the sanctions regarding Ukraine. So why does this matter? Why are the Russian oil and gas reserves so important? Well, these are the largest remaining undeveloped oil and gas reserves in the world. And we know that development and combustion of these reserves will push global atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations far above the level of dangerous climate disruption. A recent paper in Nature put it this way, quote, development of resources in the Arctic is incommensurate with efforts to limit average global warming to 2 degrees C. So ExxonMobil can say that they believe that climate change is real and they accept the science, but everything they are doing is incommensurate with actually accepting the science. And then, of course, I don't want to belabor this, but as you all know, some people think this whole thing is just a hoax. And what I want to point out, though, is that it's not just bombast and rhetoric. It's not just talk. As we know, President Trump has withdrawn the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, which most people think is our best chance for international cooperation. But more than that, he has scuttled the Clean Power Plan, which is required by law as determined by the Supreme Court in Mass versus EPA. He has consciously, actively promoted coal, the dirtiest, dangerous fuel we have. I always like to say coal is so 19th century. And he nominated Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, who in the hearings misrepresented the history of the Clean Air Act and suggested that he would, in fact, vote to overturn Mass versus EPA. But one of the things that we found in our work, and I think this is really important to understand, is that it's not just the current administration. The history of polarization on environmental issues and climate change goes back to about 1990. If we go back before 1990, we find that the Republican Party led on many environmental issues, including even climate change at times. I mean, I don't want to overstate what they did on climate change, but certainly Republicans were in the forefront of environmentalism in the early part of the 20th century. Some of you know that the American environmental movement really began in the Republican Party, led by Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist, John D. Rockefeller. And when the Wilderness Act passed Congress in 1964 and designated over 9 million acres of American lands as, quote, areas where man himself is a visitor and does not remain, it passed the US Senate by a vote of 73 to 12 and the House of Representatives by 373 to 1. So huge bipartisan support for wilderness protection. And in fact, I did a little research to try to figure out who the one was, and it was a Democrat who voted against it because he didn't think it went far enough. From the 1930s till the 1970s, there was bipartisan support in Congress and across the United States for environmental protection. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, all of these passed Congress by large margins, and these ones were all signed into law by a Republican president, Richard Nixon. Indeed, the EPA was created by President Nixon, much to the chagrin of some of his supporters. But something happened, something really important happened in the late 1980s, actually right around 1990. If you look at this graph produced by the League of Concerned Voters, it's the environmental voting scorecard for Congress, blue for Democrats, red for Republicans. And you can see that from 1970 to 1990, Democrats are a bit more inclined to vote for environmental protection than Republicans are. But the gap between Democrats and Republicans is not that great. But it begins to shift in 1990, and it begins to shift in a big way. And you can see this large divergence that begins to develop so that today, the average Republican in Congress has an environmental scorecard of 5, and the average Democrat has an environmental scorecard of about 85. So we have this huge polarization on environmental questions. And climate change is one of many environmental issues that have got caught up in this polarization. Even as late as 1992, although I would argue that this is kind of the end of Republican environmentalism, but in 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, something many people seem to have forgotten. And when he did, he called on world leaders to translate the written document into concrete action to protect the planet. But that didn't happen. In fact, the opposite happened. The Republican Party and conservatives in America in general turned against environmental protection, turned against climate science, and began to deny that climate science was even a problem. So why did Republicans stop supporting environmental protection? Why did they go so far as to deny the reality of climate change? Because as we all know, it's one thing to argue about the solution to a problem. In a democracy, that's to be expected. But it's quite another to deny the facts that show that it is a problem. And this is where politics come in. where we cannot understand our current situation without being willing to talk about political polarization. Now, I know this was sponsored by the Carlisle Democrats, so it's okay to be polarizing here. No, just kidding. But this is a really tricky thing, because I've gone places where people invite me to talk about this issue, and then they say, but don't be political. And I want to say that's not possible. This is a political issue, and it was made political when people began to deny the facts of climate change in order to prevent policy action. So why did they do that? So this is the question we posed in Merchants of Doubt, and so what I'm giving you here is just a really condensed sort of Reader's Digest version. I hope if you're interested in the problem that you'll read the book and learn more about the details. But the short version is this has everything to do with the end of the Cold War. It's not a coincidence that this split, this polarization, begins in 1990. Because since the end of the Cold War, there's been an increasing commitment on the part of American conservatives to the principles of laissez-faire capitalism, to principles that had largely been abandoned after the Great Depression, after the failures of capitalism were so conspicuous. What people began to argue, conservatives began to argue, was that the failure of the Soviet Union was proof of the failure of communism, but then they took it one step further and said, if capitalism is the better system, then the best form of capitalism is the most unregulated form. That was a logical leap, but it began to inform conservative thinking across the board in this country and also in Europe. The argument was to let markets flourish and to roll back or dial back government intervention in the marketplace. Now, I want to acknowledge that sometimes that's a good idea. Markets can be overregulated. Sometimes the best solution to a problem is to be found in the private sector. But we also know that markets can fail. Markets can fail in many different ways, but the specific way that I'm interested in is when a legal product like tobacco, or cars without seatbelts, or opioid medicines, or oil and gas hurt and kill people. Sometimes economic activity, legal economic activity, creates serious problems like climate change that markets don't seem to know how to fix. And economists call these situations market failure. It's not a secret. You can open any economic textbook and find a discussion of market failure. It's something that's been known as long as we've had markets. But when you have a market failure, it requires a response from outside the marketplace, and typically that means government on the local, state, national, or international level. So the best example of this in our lifetimes is the ozone hole. Some of you will remember that the ozone hole was created by a group of legal chemicals, the so-called CFCs, chlorinated fluorocarbons, that were used primarily as refrigerants. Now, refrigerators are a good thing, so is air conditioning, but in the 1970s, a group of scientists realized that CFCs destroy stratospheric ozone, and the ozone layer protects the surface of the Earth from deadly UV radiation. Without the ozone layer, life on Earth could not exist. There would be no life. We would all be fried, literally. So we had a situation where a perfectly legal product designed to do good things, like create refrigeration, was threatening the very existence of life on Earth. So what did we do? Well, we responded. The governments of the world got together and passed the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. This was an international treaty to phase out the production and use of CFCs and other related chemicals. And guess what? It worked. A lot of conservatives like to say, oh, government is inefficient, government doesn't work, government's just a boondoggle, regulations get in the way. But no, this worked. We're all still here. And guess what? We all still have refrigerators too. And they work just as well as the ones we had before. So the interesting fact, again, that many people don't know, the Paris Accord, which President Trump has now rejected, was based on the Montreal Protocol. The whole structure of it was based on the success of the ozone treaty. We had accurately dealt with an existential threat, and so now that seemed like a good model for this new existential threat. But it didn't quite work. So let's go back to this question of market failure. Until recently, if you asked an economist what was the greatest market failure ever, they would almost certainly have told you the Great Depression. And of course, it was the market failure of the Great Depression that led to the New Deal, to Social Security, to many of the reforms that we take for granted today, unemployment insurance and workplace safety and various other important things. But if you ask them now, you get a different answer. And the answer is climate change. Nicholas Stern, who wrote the Stern Report for the UK government on the economics of climate change, has called anthropogenic climate change, quote, the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. He has calculated the external cost of carbon, sometimes also called the social cost of carbon, to be in the trillions of dollars. And we saw that just real estate alone in the United States, 880 billion. So actually it's probably many tens of trillions, maybe even hundreds of trillions. And so Lord Stern is now a major advocate for carbon pricing, also known as a carbon tax. So the short answer for why denial is so prevalent among folks in the private sector and conservatives, the readers of the Wall Street Journal, it's not the only reason. It's a complicated issue, and there are many reasons why people can be in denial on this issue. But one of the driving forces is that many American conservatives are committed to the principles of opposing higher taxation and opposing big government. And if you believe in the magic of the marketplace, then you're going to be reluctant to admit it when the magic fails, when the music runs out. And add to this one more key piece, the claim that if government intervenes, we lose our personal freedom. This is a mantra among many people on the conservative right. So I'm just going to show you a tiny, tiny clip, one more clip from the film. This is a rally of the Americans for Prosperity. Tim Phillips, the head of it, the Tea Party, is greeting his people. And I want you to listen to how he greets his people.
Good afternoon, fellow freedom lovers!
Fellow freedom lovers, as if we don't love freedom too, right? So here's the take home. Climate change denial is not about the facts. It's never been about the scientific facts. And anyone who thinks it is, well, they need to read my book. Climate change is what sociologists call implicatory denial. You reject facts because you don't like their implications. And you, in a sense, go straight to the implications. So you don't really take seriously the scientific evidence. You just immediately jump to the conclusion that this is going to lead to higher taxes. So it's like rejecting the evidence that smoking is addictive, which many people did for a long, long time, including many very educated people, including many doctors, because if you smoke, it's basically admitting that you're an addict. And what respectable person wanted to admit that? So what's the implication? That the free market isn't magic? That we need government to intervene? That we need governance? That there's a reason we have government, and this is one of those reasons. Now, the fossil fuel industry, of course, plays a major role because climate change denial is primarily funded and promoted and organized by the fossil fuel industry. And obviously, they don't want to give up a profitable product. But why does it succeed with the American people? That was the question I wanted to answer because it seemed to me obvious why ExxonMobil would do what they did. But why would we buy it? Why would we believe it? Because it plays on our belief in free markets, our resistance to big government, our dislike of taxes, and there's a reason they call themselves the Tea Party, right? And we in Boston know that, and our love of freedom. And of course, up to a point, those are all reasonable things. I don't really like taxes either, and I do love freedom. So here's the crucial point, but I also think the grounds for hope. And I know it's taken me a while to get there, but I think if you don't understand the whys and wherefores of the issue, then I think you'll misdiagnose where the potential for hope is. I want to argue that acting on climate does not mean we have to have bigger government or higher taxes. I want to argue that the fossil fuel industry wants you to think that it does, but they're wrong. So how do we know? How can I say that? Well, if we look at the other issues where science was also challenged by merchants of doubt, there's a pattern here. Our book was all about the pattern, that this playbook had been developed by the tobacco industry, but then they used it for pesticides and the ozone hole and acid rain and now climate change. And in every single case, we fixed these problems, and we didn't end up paying higher taxes, and we didn't end up losing our freedom. So I'll just give you a few examples. Think about acid rain. Sometimes when I give talks, somebody in the audience will stand up, usually kind of belligerent, and say, Well, I'm old enough to remember acid rain, and so I don't believe in climate change. Well, of course, this is a complete non sequitur, right? Because we fixed acid rain. So how did we fix acid rain? Well, we fixed it with an emissions trading system. It was an emissions trading system that was designed by Republicans, signed into law by a Republican president, and guess what? Our taxes did not rise. In fact, the price of electricity in the Midwest actually fell as utilities were motivated to install new, cleaner generating capacity. And I can tell you, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Midwest. People there did not lose their freedom. They do not live under a Soviet dictatorship, even though the coal industry insisted that they would. So we solved this problem with a sensible law, with governance. Now, we can argue that there was some loss of freedom. The coal utilities lost their freedom to dump pollution into the atmosphere without being responsible for it, but I would argue that that was an appropriate loss. What about the ozone hole? I've already mentioned that we fixed it through an international treaty that banned the chemicals that caused ozone depletion. Did our taxes rise? Did we lose our freedom there? No, absolutely not. As I've already said, we still have refrigerators. We still have air conditioners. We didn't lose the freedom to buy those products and use them. The government did not tell us that we could no longer have refrigeration. Quite the contrary. What happened was that the private sector, mainly the DuPont Corporation, who was the major manufacturer of these chemicals, was now incentivized to find replacements. And they did. And it turned out that those replacements worked just as well, were safer, and didn't actually cost any more. I like to say, we all know the phrase, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, regulation is a very powerful form of necessity. And then, of course, there's tobacco, where this whole story begins. In Merchants of Doubt, we showed that the folks who were promoting doubt about the reality of anthropogenic climate change had previously worked with the tobacco industry to promote doubt about the harms of smoking. And that includes that avuncular character you saw at the beginning of this talk saying that he was as thick as they were. He worked with R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris. And by doing this, they staved off meaningful regulation of tobacco for decades after the science was clear. And millions of Americans died of preventable tobacco-caused diseases. So how did we finally protect ourselves from this deadly yet legal product? Well, it turns out it wasn't just one thing. And I actually think this is the most important take-home of our research, the diversity of different instruments that were used to finally bring the tobacco industry under some measure of control. First of all, there was legal action, both by ordinary citizens who sued the tobacco companies, by the state attorneys who had a major lawsuit, and also by flight attendants who brought attention to the danger of secondhand smoke and sued for lung cancers caused by smoke in aircraft, and perhaps most important of all, the prosecution of the tobacco industry by the US Department of Justice under the RICO statutes. Under this, the Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, essentially saying that this was a form of organized crime. The industry was found to have committed fraud against the American people, and the prosecution revealed the long history of industry disinformation, malfeasance, and fraud. And in fact, our work would not have been possible without these lawsuits, because it was through discovery that the documents became available that proved that all of this was true. So this is one reason why I love lawyers. I'm a great friend of lawyers. Lawyers are a historian's best friend. So just keep bringing the documents on. But it wasn't just legal action. It was also citizens' organizations to create local bans on smoking in public places, which changed the cultural narrative. The federal government banning smoking on airplanes, which started to then get private sector support because the airline industry supported that. And of course, taxes. That states raised taxes on tobacco products primarily to discourage young people from taking up the habit, and we have very good evidence that this was highly effective. So again, was there a loss of freedom? Well, maybe, depending on how you look at it. Smokers can't smoke anywhere they want anymore. Now they mostly have to smoke in the privacy of their own homes. But on the other hand, there was a huge gain of freedom, the freedom of the majority of Americans not to be harmed by secondhand smoke. Was there a net increase in taxation? No. Smokers had to pay more for the right to smoke, but most of us now pay less because we no longer pay the huge costs of smoking-related damage. So given this whole history of denial, disinformation, obfuscation, why should we believe anything the climate deniers say? Well, short answer is we shouldn't. Given their history, they really shouldn't be viewed as having any credibility at all. And this is why I always advise my scientific colleagues, don't debate them, don't engage in a framework that gives these views credibility. But there's another even better argument for why we should reject climate change denial. Because the solution to climate change already exists, and it doesn't require bigger government, higher net taxes, or loss of freedom. In fact, I want to argue that if it's done right, it will grow the economy, not the government, and increase our options, and thereby increase our freedom. And it's the clean energy revolution. So here's the good news part of the story. You wouldn't know it watching Fox News or CNN, or even reading the New York Times, or listening to the oil and gas industry executives insisting that we can't live without fossil fuels. But both in this country and around the world, there is an energy revolution taking place. As many of you do know, the cost of solar photovoltaic electricity has fallen exponentially. This runs out in 2014, but it's even lower now. So it's a huge, huge drop, so that solar power is now cheaper than fossil fuels in many places in the world. It's now the cheapest form of new installed electricity in 60 countries around the world. And again, this is not Greenpeace saying this is Bloomberg News. No surprise, as the price has fallen, capacity has soared. So we've seen huge increases in the amount of solar electricity being generated around the globe. Wind power capacity is also rising, also being driven by large decreases in cost. Renewables are half of all new electricity being installed around the globe right now. So this change is happening. And in China, which our present administration loves to vilify, and there's certainly plenty of things not to like going on in China today, but in 2017, China announced cancellation of 104 new coal plants. In fact, they have plans in place in many regions of the country to phase out coal completely. So what's driving this energy revolution? This is really important for us because we need to know what's driving it in order to know what we need to do to support it. So is it the magic of the marketplace? Maybe the private sector is responding and we don't have to worry. Well, not quite. It's not the private sector alone driving this change. It's the power of sensible public policy that stimulates the market to move in the direction we need it to move. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this in recent years, but the one I find most compelling is the work done by colleagues at MIT. Jessica Transick and her students did a major study looking at this question: what was it that was driving this massive drop in the cost of photovoltaic electricity? And what they found was there were a number of factors, but the most important that I've highlighted here, policies that stimulate market growth. And the most important was the German feed-in tariff, where the German government guaranteed that anyone who generated solar PV would be able to sell it into the system at a fair market price. This encouraged the major manufacturers like Siemens to go whole hog deep into PV production. And once Siemens got involved and other major manufacturers, economies of scale kicked in and the price began to fall dramatically. So a key government policy guaranteeing a market, a demand for the product that then sets in motion a kind of virtuous cycle. So in other words, it's the market responding to policy incentives. Now going forward, most economists, as I've already mentioned, think the single most important or effective thing we could do is to put a price on carbon to discourage the use of carbon-based fuels and thereby indirectly encourage the uptake. And of course, this is at the federal and the local level. And again, around the world, carbon pricing, 46 countries now already have or are seriously considering carbon pricing. This includes China, France, Ireland, Sweden, Mexico, and the European Union. In Canada, well, Alberta is doing weird things at the moment, but BC has a stable carbon pricing system. And here in the United States, of course, California under AB 32, and here in Massachusetts, we're part of the RGGI system. Now, in all these cases, the carbon price is probably still much too low, the one exception being Sweden, $168 a ton. We can talk about those details if people are interested. And of course, if we're honest, we have to admit carbon pricing is a kind of taxation. But the key argument, I think, is that it doesn't mean that our net tax burden has to grow. We can counterbalance the increased price of fossil fuels by reducing taxes elsewhere. So for example, by reducing payroll taxes, by reducing corporate taxes, or if it's done on the state level, by reducing state taxes. And this is what many municipalities have done successfully from British Columbia to Kazakhstan. In other words, we have the technology we need, but to get it, and to get it at the scale we need, and to get it fast, because time is running out, we need the right incentives. Not convinced? Okay, well, I want to show you one more thing that brings it home. So I've had the good fortune in the last few years to go to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where I've worked with some terrific colleagues from Carnegie Mellon University who have been developing computer visualizations of numerical data. And one of the visualizations they have made is a visualization of the uptake of renewable energy in the United States. So here's me in Switzerland looking happy because they give you lots of free champagne. And you can see in the background our graphic. So here's a detail of this. And I think that these graphics, more than any other information I've seen, show you, not just tell you, but show you the power of effective public policy. So this graphic shows the distribution of solar photovoltaic power in the United States, where installed photovoltaic electricity shows up as a little bright light. And as you can see, this is 1984, and there's almost nothing. There's a weird little light in Florida. It's actually Epcot Center. And if some of you know, Epcot was supposed to be experimental prototype community of tomorrow. It was supposed to be a futuristic community, so they actually installed PV, who knows when, a long time ago. Okay, now we're going to fast forward, and in the live version, we do this as a kind of time-lapse photography, but I don't have the bandwidth for that here. So we just fast forward to 2015. And look at this. So I want you to notice a couple of things here. Obvious things, the Northeast and California, right? Not Arizona, not Utah, not Texas. There are some pretty sunny places in this place, places that are a lot sunnier than Massachusetts, but have less photovoltaic power. Why? Well, the obvious answer you already know. These are the states with strong policies to support renewable energy: California, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and a little bit around the rims of Florida, and a bit here and there in other places too. But the states with the strongest policies are the ones that have the greatest uptake. So it's not being controlled by the amount of sunshine, it's being controlled by public policy. And I want to just hone in on one detail that people here will particularly appreciate. Look at this. What do you see here? Rhode Island. Yeah, I know, I showed this in Switzerland and people had to be told that that was Rhode Island, but okay. They've got wind, exactly. But until 2 years ago, they didn't have a renewable portfolio standard. Now they do, but it's focused on wind. So I'm going to try to create another graphic with wind. But this is the proof positive, right? Our friends in Rhode Island are no less educated and no less intelligent than we are. And their educational levels are pretty similar to Connecticut and Massachusetts. And their income levels are pretty similar. But we have so much more solar PV in Massachusetts because we have policies that support it. And I don't have the super close-up of this, but actually it's kind of cool. If you really hone in on this, there's an even brighter spot just east of here, and it's Lexington. So shout out to Zori. I know, I think it's all those MIT professors there. So, and also look at New Jersey, right? That's because New Jersey was one of the first states to implement a renewable portfolio standard. Okay, so a little bit more good news, because I want you to leave happy. All this renewable energy doesn't just light up our homes, it also creates jobs. And this is where I feel like, you know, for the Democrats in the audience or anyone in public policy, this is the huge message that we have to get out, right? Americans care about jobs. Remember Carville, it's the economy, stupid. This is good news for people, it's good news for the environment, and it's good news for the economy. In the United States today, it's estimated that there are about 65,000 jobs in coal, about 195 jobs in oil and gas. So how many jobs are there in clean energy? Well, it's really hard to get good statistics. People argue about what constitutes clean energy, but it's somewhere between 769 and 3.5 million jobs. So even at the low end of this estimate, this is 3 times the number of jobs in fossil fuels. The reality is, There are very few jobs in fossil fuels in America, very few. There are a couple of places in America where they're important, and of course we have to acknowledge that and think about how to deal with that, but there are so many more jobs in the clean energy environment. They're in every state. Every state has wind or solar capacity or both. They're actually, ironically, more in red states than blue ones, and it's one of the fastest growing sectors of the US economy. In 2015, the most recent year for which I was able to get statistics, 13% growth. That's huge. So it's one of the fastest growing parts of the US economy. Solar alone now exceeds all jobs in oil, gas, or coal, and this is from the International Renewable Energy Agency Bureau statistics. Here's a comparison. The automobile industry, 7.25 million jobs. So we're still not matching the oil industry, but we're actually like moving in that direction. So in an economy where growth overall is sluggish, renewable energy growth is strong, and it's outpacing many other sectors. So the take-home is that there is real good news here. The technology we need to fix this problem largely exists. We don't need a miracle technological solution from Mars. And it creates good jobs that can't easily be outsourced. But there is one serious problem still. We're just not implementing it fast enough. So to accelerate the great energy transition that we need the right policies that support the renewable industry and that discourage fossil fuel production and consumption. Take-home message, here it is again, technology plus policy is our solution. To solve the energy climate problem, we need technology and policy. We need to eliminate subsidies to fossil fuels to allow renewables to compete on a level playing field. We need to internalize the external cost, that is to say, pay the true cost of carbon. We could do that through the Energy Innovation Act that's pending in Congress now, or many other possible plans, and invest in the infrastructure to make renewable energy work. And this would be a different talk, and I'm happy to answer questions about this. There is work that needs to be done to make the infrastructure renewable friendly, but of course it was the United States government that built our first energy infrastructure, and the United States government can build our second energy infrastructure. So we don't need bigger government, but we do need different policies. Policies that help us create the future that we want for ourselves, for our children and our grandchildren, and for all the other humans and creatures with which we share this beautiful planet. And that's the thought I want to end with tonight, because the thing that's tough about climate change is that it's often a gloom and doom story. It's perceived as very negative, but everything that motivates me to work on this question is positive, because for me, fighting climate change isn't about saving the planet. The planet will go on very well, thank you very much. The planet doesn't really care what we do. But it's about protecting us and all the things we love and ensuring a beautiful future for us all. Or as Mary Robinson said as she was here last week in Boston, talking to mothers out front, it's about imagining the future that we want and making it happen. And I want to make one final point before I leave you. It's not fixing climate change that will lead to bigger government and loss of freedom. It's actually denying it. And this, I think, is such an important point that we ended our film with it, and so I'm going to end tonight with that as well. So bear with me and we'll just have one more, one more film clip. As sea level rises and hurricanes become more intense, people get killed, their houses and communities get destroyed. Or think about heat waves and droughts that ruin agricultural communities. All of these are problems that it will require government intervention to address. The great irony of this story, to me, is that people who don't like big government are going to get more of it. And we're going to see more money being spent on dealing with the aftermath of these disasters. There will be billions of dollars in real estate losses, but more than that, people will die. That's why it matters. That's why this is meaningful for us and not just for polar bears or people in Bangladesh. That's why so many people in the scientific community now are really starting to talk in very worried tones, because there's, I think, a growing sense in the scientific community that we're running out of time to prevent a train wreck. So let's all do what we can to prevent the wreck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Well, before we start taking questions, I would like to acknowledge Representative Tammy Govea. I'd also like to mention that we have legislation this session that deals with a lot of the issues and solutions that Naomi has presented on the screen. We have Senator Barrett, who's been a champion of carbon pricing since 2013. We have Representative Benson, who has another carbon pricing bill in the House. This is all good. We have Representative Govea, who has a bill out. Well, she has many bills out, but or co-sponsored, but one on building codes that I think is extremely important as well. So there are, and I'm just giving you the top of the iceberg there with regard to what legislation is out there. So we need to pay attention. We need to talk about this topic. We need to discuss and make people aware of what legislation is out there and how it ties in to where we need to be. The pace is critical. The pace and the scale, those are the things. And we've got to kick this up a few notches here. So with that, my little speech, do we have questions from the audience? Okay. This is a little tricky. Sure. Should we take questions first or here? Okay. I think this is not a mobile mic. I don't know how far I can get it, but if you can project when you ask a question, or come up here, I can repeat the question as well. This is actually I'm going to meet you halfway here. Two things.
So we're looking for ways to kind of adjust the market price of how we value fossil fuels in relation to climate change. I think a fairly obvious place to start is to eliminate the subsidy. It's $26 billion a year going to the fossil fuel industry that the American taxpayer is handing over. Like, if we just don't give them that money, that's a lot of money that we could put towards, other options.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm totally in favor of the complete elimination of all subsidies to fossil fuels. And it's interesting. Can people hear me, or do I need to get the mic back? Yeah. Oh, can maybe just. I'm going to ask people to come. Yeah, they should come down. Yeah. Thanks. I think we should absolutely eliminate all subsidies to fossil fuels, and I think it's a great place to start, especially with the readers of the Wall Street Journal who insist that they believe in a free market, and yet then you post them, well, then why not just let the fossil fuel industry compete on a level playing field? And suddenly they get really quiet. And then the defenders of the fossil fuel industry will say, well, those subsidies don't really matter anyway. And then you say, oh, well, in that case, they should be quite happy to give them up. So I absolutely think that we need to do that. One of the tricky things about this whole issue is that there are many things that we can do, and many of them could be efficacious. I've focused on carbon pricing because there seems to be momentum for that at the moment, and we have Senator Barrett here, who I know has been a real champion of this. But it's not the only game in town. And one of the things that I think is really important, Lana just mentioned building codes. So there's really important work that was done in British Columbia about what they did there. Mark Gerard, who teaches at Simon Fraser University, has published on this extensively and has a new book coming out soon that I highly recommend. And the carbon pricing system got a lot of attention there, and that was a good thing because they built a coalition that included business leaders, and a conservative government supported it. So that was important, and that was an important proof of concept. But there's pretty good evidence that actually what's made more of a difference to people's energy use is a set of regulations that were kind of under the radar and that nobody paid that much attention to, including things like appliance standards. And we know in California, appliance standards have been a big part of the California energy efficiency story. So building codes, absolutely. And I think, I'm not a politician, I'm an academic, a scholar, a writer. So, but one thing I think is kind of obvious if you watch politics is it is the art of the possible. And if you think you can get building codes in, then by all means we should be doing that, and nobody should discount the importance and significance of things like that.
I'm going to try to scan the room. So we started there. Any questions from the middle section? Okay, yes.
I just wonder, Naomi, how you feel about, or what your perspective is on, there's a pretty strong movement for divestment, which I was at the demonstration at Harvard about a week ago, and I'm not sure, I'm not asking you to speak to the administration.
No,
Harvard,
I won't do that, yeah.
And you have either perspective on divestment, because if you just pull all the investment, it must be trillions of dollars in investment in the project. Some of us in this room are part of that investment. So what's the framework for divestment, in other words?
Yeah, the question is, what's my position on divestment? I absolutely support it. I think it's completely irrational to say that you know that climate change is serious, that you understand that we have to phase out the use of fossil fuels, and then continue to invest in the development of more fossil fuels, more fossil fuel infrastructure. And one thing I think sometimes people don't understand, or at least sometimes when I'm trying to get my head around something that seems completely insane, and so I think, well, how could that not seem insane? Maybe people don't understand the long time frame of oil and gas development, but I'm a geologist by training. I used to work in mineral resource development. Some of my best friends went to work in the oil and gas industry. If you invest $1 in exploration today into oil and gas exploration, you will probably not actually be pumping out that oil and gas for at least 30 years to come. And then once the field begins to be developed, you're going to hope that that field will last for at least 50 years, if not 70 to 100. So that means $1 invested in fossil fuels today is a commitment to be using oil and gas, more new oil and gas 30 years from now. And that's exactly what we know we cannot do. I have made this argument to the Harvard administration. One of the mysteries to me about Harvard is why they don't listen to their smart students and faculty. But that's a whole different question. And I don't begin to explain the institution that I'm happy to have a job at. So thanks for the question.
My understanding of the China Belt and Road program is that although they're canceling coal-fired power plants at home, they're building coal-fired power plants in other countries, particularly Africa, but also Southeast Asia. How do we deal with that? We have a lot of wonderful solutions for how we change the market at home. What do we do about other countries like China?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. What do we do about other countries like China? And of course, this is what economists would call the free rider problem. But I think one thing that is obvious is that you have no credibility when you try to tell other people what to do and you don't clean up your own act, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons why when my husband and I moved here to Carlisle, one of the first things we did was put solar panels on our roof. And one of my esteemed colleagues at Harvard said, "Oh, that's stupid. That doesn't make any difference." And I said, it makes a huge difference when I stand up in public and people say, well, what are you doing about this problem, right? So, charity begins at home and so does conservation. So the United States has completely lost its leadership position because of this issue, but that could be regained. And so that's the biggest argument for beginning at home. The other big argument, and I'm not an expert on international development, but Nick Stern is, and so I've posed this question to him. And one of the things he thinks is extremely important is for the United States and Europe to reinvest in the development banks, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, because one of the reasons these countries are building coal-fired power plant is because they cannot get the financing that they would need for renewable energy development. So that's one possibility that could make a real difference, and we've really dropped the ball on that, but that ball could be picked up. I can just repeat the question, I think that. Just what? I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Tony Saba from Berkeley, his disruptive technology analysis and looking at
at the price of batteries coming down like solar, and then transportation, which is a big contributor to CO2, that in the next 5 to 10 years there'll be a disruptive transition to electric cars and batteries. We're already displacing peakers with batteries, and it's not economic to fill a gas-fired peaker anymore, but batteries are replacing that. So his thinking is that it's the next 10 years you've got this major disruptive technology. It's a very interesting discussion he has. You can get it on YouTube, Tony Seba.
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular work, but I am familiar with a lot of work in the history of technological innovation and development. I've written some things on that myself, and Eric Kame, my co-author, is a historian of technology by training. So I don't know this particular work. This is about the question of whether batteries in the next 5 to 10 years will be so good that we'll all have electric cars. So is he arguing we won't have to worry because this is happening, or is he?
It's happening, and he starts his whole premise with a picture of Times Square in 1900.
Oh, with the horses, yeah.
Find the car.
Yeah, horses and cars. Okay.
13.
Yeah.
Find the other, find the.
Okay, so I know the argument, even I don't know this particular person. So here's the tricky thing about this. He's absolutely right that there have been significant major technological transformations that sometimes have happened rather quickly, sometimes in as little as 10 years. But when you look closely, you find out two things. First of all, they're never really quite as quick as they seem. It's perfectly true you can juxtapose the photographs, but what that's not telling you is about all the engineering and scientific work and all the investment that had to go in up front before those cars actually hit the market and became, a retail product that people could buy. And, and that's true of not just automobiles, that's true of lots of things. So there's a less visible history of technological development that precedes these transformations. And when you look at that, it's almost never just as little as 5 years. So, which is not to be pessimistic. I have great hope for electric cars and battery and storage. But it is to say that if we expect this will all happen quickly without some kind of support, I think that's unrealistic. And that's the second piece. So Eric Conway and I actually have looked at this. At one point we were going to write a book on it, and I don't know, it just seemed too wonky or something. But it is part of an argument we're making in our current book project. So if you look at the major technological transitions, things like electricity, radio, telephone, telegraph, television, space travel, not one of these was done by the private sector alone. Not a one. Every single one involves some kind of important government role. Financing, regulation, standardization, in the case of electricity, bringing it to rural Americans, every single one. And so what that's telling us is, yes, technological innovation is hugely important, and yes, it changes people's lives, and yes, we want it, but it's got to be supported by the right public policies. And so that's why I emphasize this idea of technology plus policy.
Well, yes.
Yeah. In my house, I have a system where I have storage for a solar system. If the power grid goes down, our stuff, we have stuff that keeps running. I have no way to sell that power back to the grid for peak. I know they're by peak pricing, they have a way to encourage some people to use batteries during peak times. But if the grid is suddenly dipping, there's no way for the grid to say, I'll buy some of your power from your batteries. And that's an example of infrastructure that should be there, and it's not.
Right. Well, would that be a good time to invite one of our political leaders who's here to say something about this issue? Tammy, do you want to? Or Mike?
Say something, and I'll
You go first on this one.
Well, I hope there's, State Senator Mike Barrett, I hope there's help on the way. By the way, I want to thank you,
You should come to the
Naomi.
Yeah, you want to come on down. Come on down.
Actually, I just bought Naomi's book. The state is developing something called a clean peak standard. It builds naturally on some policies we have in place too, but the last speaker, the last generator of the question is absolutely right. There's got to be a way to reward the utilities, incent the utilities to take your stored energy back at exactly the moment when the electric power system is under the most statewide or regional stress. And the Baker administration is actually, I speak as a Democrat, and I want to give credit where it's due. The governor's administration is working hard on this clean peak standard. I think it's going to enable us to really draw on decentralized sources of storage. The storage that sits in your electric vehicle battery, or possibly in a battery that you've got in your home. I'm relatively optimistic that we're going to see significant regulatory developments. We already have the right laws in place, so it's just a matter of working out the real nitty-gritty and promulgating the standards authorized by those statutes.
Another obvious thing is to be able to do things like tell cars not to charge. Right, you know, during peak time, if a car wants to charge or a hot water heater, there are things that you can delay, and it won't make that much difference to the consumer, but there's no infrastructure to control it.
Well, again, this is why these policies are so important. So thank you for that. And, you know, as you said, there's so many great ideas. I mean, I know in Silicon Valley there have been people who have been working on smart appliances that would do what you said, that they would be connected to your meter, and when the price went up, they would just, like your fridge could turn off for a minute or 30 seconds and then turn back on. And the technology to do this exists. But again, you need the right regulatory structure to make it work for the utilities and for the consumer, right? Tammy, did you want to add something? Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having us here. So I'm a brand new state representative, and while I have a background in environmental health and spent a lot of time doing EJ work really early on, this is a whole new area of work that I'm learning a whole lot about. So I appreciate you taking the response to that particular question, because I didn't know that, so I appreciate that. So back to the net zero stretch energy code policy, or bill that I filed just for a moment. We know that 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation, but here in the Northeast, 40% are from our buildings. And so there's a lot more that we need to be doing really quickly to increase the energy efficiency of our buildings, which is why I filed that particular piece of legislation. Because we don't have time to wait for the whole legislative process, I also testified before the Board of Building Regulations and Standards earlier this week to encourage them to adopt the net zero stretch energy code. Now, you probably know this. For all of the communities, there are 241 that signed up to be part of the green communities. They're now held by a ceiling and can't go beyond that, and requiring that buildings, new buildings and buildings that undergo major renovations are net zero. And so that's why we filed that, really trying to encourage the BBRS to adopt it sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, even on this regulatory board, there is a sort of division between those who really embrace and understand the urgency of addressing climate change, and then the vested interest of the builders who make the claim that, well, it's too expensive, you're going to price out people, and they're not going to be able to renovate, and all of those other issues. So I appreciate the sort of economic argument of taking account of all of the costs and what does it mean long term, because if we're building green buildings, if we're building energy efficient buildings, low-income people benefit more than those of us who have more means, who have greater means, because their energy costs will be reduced. So it's a matter of sort of having that longer-term view, which is, you know, one of the things that really frustrates me, quite honestly, about policy making and the way that we approach problem solving is we don't account for, well, what are those unintended consequences 25, 50 years down the line. The reason why we're suffering with really unreliable public transportation and don't have a really interconnected system for folks here in Carlisle to Concord to Western Mass is because policymakers before us did not make the needed investments. And so we're suffering the consequences of a really dysfunctional system, and it's our responsibility to address that now so that future generations 25, 30, 50 years from now are not suffering from the same consequences that we're suffering from, and then of course the whole climate change aspect. But what this really does require is increases in revenue. We don't have enough in the budget right now to be able to invest in pay for all the things that we need to pay for. We know we need to be paying for public education that has gone underinvested in, and the public transportation system, and a whole host of other areas. So just know that as we have this conversation in the House around, well, how do we raise revenue and how do we do it in a way that's fair and equitable and doesn't burden populations that are already struggling so much, that's going to be part of the conversation, and I think it's one that's going to take courage on a lot of my colleagues' part, but it's critical, and it's part of that whole policy mindset. When I was running for office, I would often talk about, we have the technology to do it, it's about having the political will, but it also means we have to have the money, and that's another sort of component of having political will.
So can I ask you a question? So what can we as citizens do to support you? Because most of us don't wake up in the morning thinking, man, I've got to help represent Govea. Yeah. I have to help her with that building code issue, you know? Right. And building codes, like, it's not sexy, it's not something totally that, but yet it's really, as you said, really important. Right. And it does save people money in the long run. So, like, how can this group, this community, Carlisle Democrats, how can we support the building code initiative?
Well, I would say this is not only for the building code initiative, but any initiative, but specifically for the building code, send a letter to the BBRS and encouraging them to adopt a net zero stretch energy code. If they're hearing from constituents, it's the Board of Building Regulations and Standards. I can get information on, yeah, I can get that to Lana, and then maybe you can get that out. I don't have the contact information off the top of my head. The encouraging thing is that the vice chair, my understanding is, really supportive of moving in the direction of adopting a lot of codes to support mitigating climate change and the impact. So that's the good news. The current chair is less inclined, is my understanding. So, and she'll be coming in, I think, in 2020. So there's a reason to be optimistic. But even beyond any specific policy is to reach out to your friends and neighbors who might not think the same way that you do, or that have not already understand the urgency of why we need to be adopting policies right away to change the way that we do business right now, the way that we heat our homes, the way we drive our cars, the way we get to work and school, et cetera, et cetera. So I encourage you to, I don't need to hear from you, I'm already on board. It's a matter of getting to the state reps and the policymakers who are a little bit slower to adopt it, or listen to the opposing arguments for why it's not urgent for us to act now, or why it's not economically feasible for us to change the way that we do business, the way we build homes, et cetera, et cetera. So talk to your neighbors and friends who are not, you know, in your same political circles. Get them to reach out to their state reps, because I need my colleagues to help me. Can't do it alone. The Senate is usually really pretty great on all of these issues. The House, as you probably know, tends to lag behind, and we need to really get the House ramped up faster. So it's about advocacy.
Yeah. So here's a couple of good historical examples you can use when you write that letter. I mean, there's a long history of every time someone wants better codes, that the industry involved always says it's too expensive, the American people won't pay for it. So famous example is seatbelts. Detroit kicked and screamed, it'll be too expensive, nobody will accept it, people won't use them. And you know, tens of thousands of lives are saved every year now from seatbelts, right? Or my other favorite example is earthquake safety codes. I did some research on this many years ago. When people first proposed earthquake building codes in California, same thing, building industry said, oh no, it'll be too expensive, we can't afford it. But think about it now. California, we lived through Loma Prieta, magnitude 7 earthquake, and sadly people were killed, but I think the death count was something like 35 people. The same magnitude 7 earthquake in Iran or Afghanistan or China would have killed 7,000. So we save huge amounts of life and loss of life and property just by having basic building codes that other countries don't have. And so there are so many good examples where it's the old stitch in time saves 9. You know, a little investment now makes a big difference in the future.
Two more questions, I think. Alan, who came all the way from Harvard, Mass. Harvard, Mass.
Just quickly, a response to Tammy about revenue, tax services. Last time I checked, Massachusetts was 49th in the country in terms of taxing services. We've become a service state, and there are many, many ways you can tax services without impacting, low and moderate income people. Unfortunately, it probably impact us in Carlisle, in Concord, in Lexington much more. Start taxing legal services, tax preparation services, pool cleaning services. Other states have lists that are 150 services long. You could do this and raise a tremendous amount of money, but with Republican governors, it isn't going to happen. So that's just a side. We can do this. For Naomi, I'm depressed. I'm one of these people that thinks it's probably too late. I can't try to remember the name of the author of the book that I just read called We're Doomed, Now What? But the real issue for me, if we're still trying to solve this problem on a worldwide basis, I totally buy into what he just talked about in terms of all the things we can do here in the United States. But that's a very U.S.-centered approach. I call that demand-side management. We're trying to reduce demand here in the U.S. And mind you, what we really need to start doing is looking at supply side. The oil companies, the fossil fuel industry, I think this sort of undermines that basic model you were talking about. This is not the refrigeration industry. This is not even tobacco. This is gigantic, the richest industry this world has ever seen. Just the other day, I jotted down some numbers I saw in an article about how much money they spend worldwide on lobbying each year. It's billions and billions of dollars on the last U.S. election. I forget what that number was, $100 and some million just on one election. So we need to do something about this industry that's dramatic. I didn't see articles that say we need to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. With the Montreal Protocol, we banned CFCs. It's gotten to the point, and we're running out of time, where we may need to start slowly ratcheting down the production of fossil fuels, at least in the United States. The Permian Basin has become one of the biggest producers. I think it's about to overtake Saudi Arabia as the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, and they are exporting. They become the China for oil and gas. While China's exporting coal, we're exporting. So what do you think about supply side that can address the problem worldwide?
Yeah, well, I said I wasn't going to depress you. Yeah. Look, this is an incredibly difficult, complicated problem, and it is easy to feel frustrated. I go to all kinds of meetings of scientists, and then the next thing I know, the scientists are saying, well, the real solution is campaign finance reform. And I was like, oh, yeah, like, kill me now, slay me now. So, yes, these things are all interrelated, and the supply side is huge, which is why I've been a very active proponent of divestment for the reasons we already talked about. I'm also an active proponent of legal action against the fossil fuel industry. I'm not a lawyer, but it certainly seems to me that at least in the common sense use of the word criminal, that what they've done is criminal. I've participated in amicus briefs. I've been an expert consultant to the County of San Mateo for the case they've brought on there. I guess for me personally, I think we all have to make choices about what we think could work, and nobody knows, nobody has a crystal ball. People always ask me, what should I do? Especially students ask me that, and I say, you should do whatever you think you can do, Find that point of intervention that's available to you and use it. So for me personally, because I know a lot about the history of tobacco, I do believe that the lawsuits against tobacco were hugely important in terms of exposing the industry as the criminal racket that it was and delegitimizing smoking from a cultural standpoint. And I think that was a game changer. We still have a big problem with how the tobacco industry operates overseas. We have not fixed the tobacco problem, but we've made lots of progress here in the United States and also in Europe. And it has to continue, and I work with people also who are involved in the international conventions on tobacco control. So personally, I'm cautiously optimistic that legal action could be a game changer. But I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, and that's why I think we have to try a number of different things at once. You know, during the Manhattan Project, when the United States, Europe was losing the war, and the United States decided to join and to build an atomic bomb, they did not sit around arguing about what the best way to build an atomic bomb would be. They made a list of all possible ways, and they did them all. And it cost a lot of money, but it worked. I mean, we can argue about whether bombs should have been used or not, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, and in a very short period of time, about 2 years, we went from basic science to building a deliverable atomic weapon. So we know that we can do these kinds of things when we commit, when we take it seriously, and when we view it as an emergency. So I do think we have to start using the language of emergency. And we've been a little loath to do that because then we get accused of being alarmists. But what I say to that is, when the house is burning down, you pull the fire alarm. And the house is now burning down.
Before you go any...
Okay, but we also have to have time for book signing and such, right? Okay, hold on. I'm standing here. I guess, Of course it has to, it's good. All right, I like this. Plants.
requires some explanation. So these are herbs that I picked up today at Clark Farm, by the way. And there was some significant, speaking of local issues, I'd also like to give a shout out to Barney Arnold, our new Board of Select. Yes, stand. There she is. Put in solar panels, canopies in 2 locations in town. We also approved a master plan, which is going to help us move forward. And there's one more thing. We're going to start town-wide composting, folks. So back to greenery here. It isn't just pretty stuff. One of the plants is chamomile. Chamomile is for energy in adversity, patience. Well, maybe you can prove it after you. Patience, long life, and wisdom. Mint is for refreshment and re-energizing. And time for continued bravery, courage, and strength. Carry on, Naomi. Thank you.